This will be an introduction to writing the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. I recommend that you do this for two reasons. Not all grammars teach you how to write the alphabet. I've chosen to include it for two major reasons. One, for the sake of your note-taking, you want to have a clear and consistent way that you can easily recognize in your notes what you've written down. And because some of these letters are kind of oddly shaped, you want to have a consistent way of doing that so that you'll recognize it coming back to your notes 2-3 days later, or giving it to someone else. They'll be able to look at that and go, oh yeah, see, I recognize the letters. You maybe do a little bit differently than I do, but I can recognize what you're doing there. The second thing is to add a tactile dimension, adding another sense in to the memorization process. That which you see, you will retain some of it, but that which you actually do feel right, you'll retain more of. And so one of the best ways of memorizing the Hebrew alphabet is to write it over and over and over. When I first learned the Hebrew alphabet, every spare moment, kind of every scrap of paper would end up with the Hebrew alphabet on it. That's a very useful way of instilling and kind of concretizing the alphabet in your mind to make it stick so that you can remember it very easily. I'm giving you the way I write these letters. You may see some variations because these, you look at what's printed and it's going to have in the fonts, these in printed fonts, whether on computer or on paper, it'll have serifs and it'll be a little bit more elaborate. I've given you here a very simple way, I think, that is effective, kind of distilling the letters down to their basic elements so that you will be able to write consistently and clearly. If there's something that you want to write a little bit differently, if you can still clearly communicate it to somebody else with your writing, by all means, do what's comfortable for you, but I'll simply be showing you how I do it. To begin with is Aleph, and if we look at it, odd form, a lot of, you could even say it's rather complex, but I think very simply, if you start with a diagonal line, give a short swoop from the top right, and then slightly off center there, if you'll notice, then slightly off center on the bottom, another short swoop, you have very easily recognizable Aleph. Beit is fairly easy, just a swoop down, kind of a reverse lowercase r, if you will, starting at the top left and then swooping down to the bottom right, and then adding a flat base at the bottom. You will notice that the base does extend out beyond. This is important for probably primarily just to differentiate this letter from the Kaf, which we'll see in a few moments. That is actually, I think, important. You don't want to over accentuate it, but make sure that that line does extend out beyond the vertical line. Next is the Gimel, another fairly simple one, starting at the top right. It's a little bit thinner than the other letters, so it doesn't go quite as far, but down to the from the top left down to the bottom right, and then giving it another little foot there. It's a little bit like the Greek lambda, but that is the Gimel. Next is the Dalit. Again, just a simple straight line at the top, horizontal straight line at the top of the letter, then a vertical ascender going straight down from that, kind of like a very offset capital T. Once again, you will notice there is a jot just straight off the top there. You do want to make that go out there because that will differentiate the Dalit from a Resh, which we'll see later on. You'll notice in the printed version, rather than going out and then leaving that flush and bringing it back in and swooping down in, just very simply one straight line and another straight line at a horizontal, at a 90-degree angle to that. Next is the Hay. Unlike the Dalit, it does not have that extending, that horizontal extender out beyond, just straight across, then at a 90-degree angle straight down, and then for your second stroke, a smaller vertical line on the left side. You will notice it does not connect to the rest of the letter. If it connects, it becomes a Chet. So the differentiation between the Hay and the Chet that you'll see in a moment is that this one does leave a space in here. You do not want to let that gap close on you. Next is the Vav. It is simply a vertical line. You'll notice I have a slight bend here at the top here. You don't even have to do that. If you just want to do a straight vertical line, that is effective as well. Many people do that, but I'm keeping just slightly similar to the printed version of it here. If you do this extra little bend in it, don't overdo it, because it'll turn into a Resh, and as you'll see in a second, it could be confused with a Zayin as well. The Zayin commonly, in your writing, can commonly become confused with the Vav, because it is very vertical and very thin as well. But if you start off with a slightly, an angled horizontal stroke, and then in the middle of that stroke, make a vertical stroke downwards, you will have a very clear, very recognizable Zayin. Notice that it does extend slightly out here. That is what is going to differentiate it from the Vav. So make sure you don't want to overdo it. This horizontal stroke is not nearly as wide as, say, the Hay or the Dalit, but you do want it wide enough that you can see distinctly that it extends on both sides of the vertical stroke. Chet starts out very much like the Hay, a horizontal stroke followed by a vertical stroke at a 90-degree angle. Again, nothing extending out beyond there. That can be flush. And then another vertical stroke on the other side, extending straight down and connecting with the top of the letter. That is the Chet. Remember, the Hay would have a space in here. They would not connect. That is what differentiates that from the Chet, which you see before you here. The Tet, again, when you're looking at it in the printed version, a little complex. It would take several strokes to draw this. This is my simplified way of doing it. First, starting at the top left, making half a square. I've got a little bit of an angle of it here, but you can make it perfectly 90 degrees if you want it, perfectly perpendicular there. So there's two strokes there, a curved stroke on the right side going up, and then just a little stroke towards the interior. And so it's sort of like a box that's fallen in on itself. But that gives you the Tet. The Yod, the smallest and simplest of the Hebrew letters, simply is drawn as an apostrophe. You do want to make sure that it does float at about the height of the top of the other letters. Presume if you're writing on line paper that there's a line just about here. You don't want this to rest on the bottom line. You want it to float up high, just at the height of the other letters. And so when you're drawing it writing it in a word, make sure to start it up high where the rest of the tops of the other letters are, not towards the bottom. It is only about half the height or less of the other letters, so the bottom of it comes nowhere near the bottom line of your writing. The Kaf is a backward C. Essentially, you just draw a backward C. to highlight what I said earlier about the Beit, you'll notice this goes down and continues on around. The bottom is not flat, but it curves into it. You don't want anything to extend horizontally out beyond the letter to make it confused with the Beit. With the Kaf, we also get to see our first final form, which looks very much like a Dalit. Starts out with the horizontal line straight across at the top, and then again with that extender, which is different than the regular Kaf, the medial or the initial Kaf. This the horizontal extender goes out beyond the vertical line here, which hits here at 90 degrees. The difference between this and the Dalit is this will go down further. Presume that we have a line here that we're writing our letters horizontal with this line right here. This does have a lower descender that goes beyond that, so it does go down lower than most of our other letters. Very simple to write, but make sure you make that very distinct extender beyond to make sure you don't confuse it with a Dalit if it is a final Kaf. Remember, the Kaf that ends a word, goes at the end of a word, will extend down further like that. Any Kaf, by the way, if it is at the end of the word, you will never see the other form of the Kaf. You will never see this at the end of the word. If it is at the end of the word, it has to be this form. Just keep in mind for making notes. Alright, next up is the Lamed. This has a little bit of an ascender. It goes a little bit higher than some of the other letters, but if you don't emphasize that, that's not too bad. The shape is rather distinctive, so it's not easily confused with any of the other ones. So we start out with a short vertical line at the top left, a horizontal line going straight across, and then a swoop down towards the bottom. Strictly formally, it looks like this one hits about the midpoint of the letter if it's in the printed version, but as you can see, I've kind of free-handed it here. You're not going to likely confuse Lamed with any other letters, so as long as you get pretty close. But again, you'll notice this is a very simplified form. Rather than swooping to the right and back to the left and to the right, and this is really 3 lines. Very simple. Compact, simple to both write and recognize. The Mem, another letter I've seen students overcomplicate before. This is how I've simplified it. Just start out drawing a triangle from the bottom left, going straight up, then curve one side of the triangle, start to close it up, but leave a gap there. Even though it probably won't confuse you if you close that gap up there, just to keep it formally correct, I would advise leaving that open. That's the regular way of doing it. And then a short line off that first side of the triangle gives you your Mem. You'll remember we also have a final form of the Mem, which starts out looking somewhat like a Resh or a Beit might, but then without having any sort of horizontal extender here, just closing it up into a square. The simplest, I've seen people very simply write this just as literally a square. Just to give it a little bit of flair, I've chosen to keep this one side rounded and have this horizontal extender stick off a little bit here to the left. Very small, not much at all to speak of, but just to remain a little bit similar to the printed form is how I do it. And that is the final Mem. Unlike the final Kaf, it does not extend above or below the rest of the letters. It stays in that same height as most of the other letters do. The Nun starts out very much like the Vav. It's, again, thinner than, say, the Mem or some of the other letters, but it starts out very much like the Vav with a very small horizontal line at a bit of an angle, and then goes straight into a vertical drop, and then at the bottom, straight out horizontally again. If you draw this too wide, it may end up looking a little bit like a Kaf, so make sure to keep this letter thin. That is how you draw the Nun. Remember, the Nun does have a final form as well. Again, kind of like the Vav, a short horizontal drawn at an angle here, and then a vertical drop down like the Kaf. This one does extend below where we might say the final, or the lower, if you're writing on lined paper, where that line would be, this is descender goes past that. That is what is going to differentiate it from the Vav. You want to make sure if you are writing a final Nun, it does go down like that to differentiate it. Next comes the Samekh. I've seen it kind of like the mem. Sometimes final mem is simplified into just a square. I have seen this written as just a circle. Some very simple Hebrew fonts do that, but I leave a little bit of a tail on it just to kind of have a similarity to this printed form, but the Samekh, just one stroke, easily done. There it is. The Ayin, I think, receives the award. It's probably contending with the Lamed for what I've seen students overcomplicate the most often, because of this little kink, in both of these. Straighten them out. Leave these off. This thing can easily be drawn very recognizably, just with a line straight up, or a curved line here, and then another curved line meeting about halfway there. It's a little bit like a Y. Again, this one does not have a descender, so it will be sitting directly on on a ruled paper on the line right here. But that is how you make the Ayin. I would, just to show you in a second how this, don't confuse this with Tsade, that you do keep this line curved and not straight. And then this line coming in on the left side of the letter can be straight. But don't try to duplicate this. It just looks a little bit overdone and sometimes confusing when students do that. Pei starts out almost identical to the Kaf as a backwards C. Then you just want to make a little half square right here, two sides of a square, so that the final result, coming down from that top left corner down and into the center, so the final result looks kind of like a capital G that's been rotated 180 degrees, and that gives you the Pei. The final Pei form is if you take that bottom horizontal arm of the Pei and just bend it straight out so that it goes down below, as you should expect by now, down below the ruled line if you were writing on line paper of the Pei, starting at the top left, going down horizontally, then down, and then the same kind of half a square extending down into the middle of the letter, where the long side of the Pei does extend down. This is the final Pei, so it's like the Kaf, like the Mem, not unlike the Mem, excuse me, like the Kaf, like the Nun. We see that it does extend down lower than the rest of the letters with that descender. Here's the Tsade. Again, can be overcomplicated, but let me accentuate for you this acute angle right here for you geometry nerds. From the top left down to the bottom right, then back to the bottom left. That's the distinctive part of the Tsade that's going to be very easily recognizable over and against the Ayin. You don't want to confuse those. The Ayin has this, again, this swoop down. The Tsade starts from the top left, straight down into the bottom right, and then you can give another arm to it there. You have a very simple, easy to write, easy to recognize Tsade. You'll recall it also has a final form. Again, it's kind of like the other ones that have the one arm kind of bent straight down. You can start with just a straight line going all the way down, descending again below the ruled line, and then you can make that curved, you can make that straight. You're not going to really confuse final Tsade with too much, but that is the final form for that letter. Left out a slide here, but the Kof start out with a vertical line over on the right side. It can extend not as far down as the other, as some of the final letters, but if it drops a little bit below the others, not a bad thing. And then it really looks almost like a backwards Q, except we don't close these up, almost like a P. But without closing these up. You can leave this little tail on here, or you can remove it. Doesn't really make it too much of a difference. You shouldn't be confusing that letter with many in the Hebrew alphabet, if any at all. That is the Kof. Resh, a simple, kind of like the Beit, chop off the bottom. Start at the top right, then make a slow bending curve down. Start at the top left, slow bending curve down to the bottom right, kind of like a reverse lowercase r. There's your Resh. Sin and Shin, very similar letters. Again, another one that could potentially be overcomplicated. I prefer just to write a kind of a wide U, and then give it a off-center angled center line, a vertical line that makes it kind of a off-center W, and then put the dot up. Pretty simple. And rather than replicate Shin for you, I'm just going to move the dot over there. So remember that over the left it's Sin, over the right it's Shin. How do we remember that? Sin is never right. Your no-fail mnemonic on that one. All right, last one is Tav. It starts out kind of like the Resh, starting at the top left and then coming and curving around to the bottom right. Honestly, if you square that off a little bit, you're not really good. That's not really what's going to confuse folks. With the Resh, you want to keep that nice and curved. With the Tav, if it squares up a little bit, shouldn't be a bad thing. What's important, however, is this little foot. What's that going to differentiate it from? The Chet. If you forget about this right here, this little foot down in the bottom left, it's going to look exactly like a Chet. And so you want that foot to jut out there. Doesn't have to jut out too far, just enough for you to see it. So you do distinguish that from the Chet, and you know that is a Tav. All right, well that's it. That's all the letters. Practice, 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 and let me know if you have any questions.